They vanished without a trace. They hid the evidence. But every secret has a file. The truth is hidden. We find it.
When we think of America's most dangerous cults, we almost always picture the final moments. We remember the sprawling, isolated compounds, the televised standoffs, and the tragic, explosive infernos. But starting the story at the fiery end creates a dangerous historical blind spot. By focusing exclusively on the violence, we assume these groups were visibly terrifying from the moment they were formed. The truth is more unsettling. As detailed in the book Charnel Shadows, nobody willingly joins a cult. People join what they believe is a vital community, a loving family, or a deeply righteous cause. If these groups don't start out as obvious monsters demanding absolute surrender, how do they actually capture their first followers? To understand the anatomy of extreme organizations, we have to look away from their tragic demises. We have to examine how their charismatic founders camouflaged their initial preaches within the specific, very real anxieties of their time. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the American social fabric was fracturing. Millions were disillusioned by political assassinations, racial inequality, and the ongoing, deeply unpopular Vietnam War. A massive generation of young people felt abandoned by traditional government institutions. They were actively out in the streets, searching for radical new ways to live together. This cultural void provided the soil for a specific type of opportunist. Charismatic figures began gathering initial flocks by promising exactly what the state had failed to provide: an inclusive, peaceful, and self-sustaining utopia. At this stage, the early recruits weren't being coerced into submission. They were finding obscure leaders who listened to them and validated their very legitimate political grievances. The most dangerous groups of the 70s planted their roots because, in their earliest days, their recruitment pitches were indistinguishable from any other earnest, progressive social movement. Then, the cultural climate shifted. The 1980s brought severe economic instability, rapid corporate downsizing, and a surging, bitter distrust of federal authority. Opportunistic leaders adapted their blueprints to match this rising tension. The promise of a peaceful utopia was scrapped. Instead, the new pitch was about surviving the imminent collapse of society. Extreme survivalist paranoia was common during the later years of the Cold War. With families already stocking up canned goods in suburban fallout shelters, making the leap to drastic physical isolation felt like a logical next step. This gave rise to the compound mentality. Cult leaders rebranded intense physical separation, moving into remote cabins or heavily guarded ranches, as the only way to guarantee a family's safety from a hostile world. The infamous, heavily armed complexes we remember from the news didn't start out as prisons. They were initially built by followers who were terrified of the outside world and believed they were constructing a sanctuary. As the 1990s drew to a close, the mass adoption of home computers coincided with a rising nervousness about the approaching millennium. The need for a physical compound was gradually replaced by the psychological isolation of early digital message boards. For the first time, leaders didn't need you to move to a ranch. They could curate a paranoid echo chamber that reached vulnerable people globally. And they found a trigger in the technology itself. Groups weaponized the deep public confusion surrounding computer systems, specifically the Y2K bug, to manufacture a tangible, apocalyptic deadline. By leaning into this specific technical anxiety, modern leaders convinced their followers to sever ties with their families and make irreversible life choices, all under the promise of digital salvation or cosmic rescue. While the internet changed how the message was delivered, the underlying mechanism was identical: exploit a temporary, widespread societal panic to demand absolute loyalty. When we pull back and look at these three distinct eras, a historical pattern emerges. Extreme organizations are not random accidents or strange glitches in American society. This graph plots spikes in national anxiety across the decades. Notice how clusters of major cult formation dates appeared during these specific windows of high public distress. This is why our collective obsession with their violent endings is dangerous. It distracts us from the slow, quiet ways they actually recruit. Recognizing how these groups historically hijacked societal fears makes it possible to identify those patterns in modern movements before they take root.